Father, we thank you for this day. Thank you for your word. Ask that as we look at your son struggling with your sovereignty in his life, that you will use his example to illuminate our path, so that what is true in your word, that the word is a lamp unto our feet, that it may actually be true in fact. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Got a question for you. Define the sovereignty of God. A 25-year-old Christian comes up to you and says, what does the Bible mean about the sovereignty of God? How would you answer that?
He's everywhere and in charge of everything.
He's everywhere, which is omnipresence. Okay?
Yeah.
But she said he's in charge.
Yeah, I know, but we're going to parse it out. When you
Well,
say,
I'm sorry.
so when you say he's in charge of everything, so what that means is if I took out a 44 Magnum and put a bullet through his brain, you're saying God's in charge of that.
I believe he could stop anything that he wants to, but I believe he lets us perform and do, and we're responsible for what we do, and the whole bit. I mean, it all goes together. He doesn't particularly, but he did stop stuff all the time in the Bible, which is what he wanted to. So we just have to trust him.
Like you being a parent with a child, you have a choice on how close you're going to manage them. Right? There's, to use the more proper term, there's one thing to say foreknowledge. It's another thing to say foreordination. God knows everything, but that does not necessarily mean everything is foreordained. Right?
Yes.
Once again, did he ordain that? You're going to tell me that God ordains murder? I thought one of the 10 Commandments says thou shalt not commit murder.
Okay.
So did God ordain the murder?
No.
However, Romans 8:28 says, all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes. There's a difference between the purposes of God and the plans of God. They're not necessarily always the same. We all can know that God can reach down and orchestrate whatever he wants. If he couldn't, he would not be omnipotent. Right? However, that's not saying that he ordained that 14-year-old girl's rape last night in Los Angeles. Any more than he would ordain me coming in here with a pistol and shooting me in the head. However, to synchronize all that with Romans 8, God says this, I'm never at a loss to use that murder. Even if I didn't orchestrate that murder, that does not mean I cannot use that murder. The Egyptian pharaohs, God said, I've raised you up for this purpose that I might demonstrate my glory. So what God says is this, I don't necessarily ordain evil, but I'm never at a loss to use that evil for my purposes. Does that make sense? Any comments or questions at this point?
Well, where does Satan fit into all of this?
Okay, we'll go down a rabbit trail.
Yeah.
Satan says, you know, God, this character Job, he's just your puppy dog. You quit feeding him and he'll walk away. Right?
Yeah.
So, what did God do with that? Did God say, no, I have ordained only good for Job, you're not going to touch it?
Oh, he allowed it.
God said, have at it. But God did one thing. I'm going to draw a boundary line with his biological life. You can do whatever you want, Satan, but he will not be physically dead at the end of your doing. Right? And that's what the Bible says in that conversation. God said you can do anything you want, but you can't take his life. So God stepped in with his omnipotence and foreordained something. He foreordained that Job was not going to die. However, he had no questions about what Satan was going to do. Okay? So there's an example, possible answer to your question. What does all that have to do with the Gospel of John? Simply this. Turn to John chapter 18. We're going to look at Jesus' trial and Jesus' crucifixion. But the lens we're going to use to look through that is the lens of Jesus' humanity and the sovereignty of God, the choices of people like Pilate, and how all that meshed. Job and Jesus had two very different starting points in their struggles. Job had no idea about what was going to happen, right? Even at the end of the story, God did not pull back the curtains of heaven and say, hey, Job, let me give you a look behind the scenes about what was really going on in the unseen world. Jesus, however, repeatedly predicted his death. He predicted that he would rise after 3 days. He even predicted his manner of death. Jesus didn't just say, I'm going to die. He said, I'm going to be crucified. A very specific statement. So what did Jesus know going in? He knew all of that. Okay? What that has to do with us is simply this. Even though Jesus knew all of that, okay, we know that, for instance, one of the statements that he made, and we'll look at others, when he was on the cross was, I am thirsty. So I'm going to ask you this. Even though Jesus knew why he had to do this, he knew what was going to happen, did that make his physical sensations go away?
No.
That means that nail, he felt it just like I would if you did that to me today. What I'm trying to show you is this. In the sovereignty of God, no matter how much you know, it does not mean it's going to hurt any less. We think if we only knew what was going to happen, or even why it's happening, that somehow it would be easier from a human point of view. Jesus does not support that idea when he makes statements like, I'm thirsty. Make sense? Okay? So, let's get into the story. John 18, and we'll start reading in verses 1. After saying these things, Jesus crossed the Kidron Valley with his disciples and entered a grove of olive trees. Judas, the betrayer, knew this place because Jesus had often gone there with his disciples. The leading priests and Pharisees had given Judas a contingent of Roman soldiers and temple guards to accompany him. Now with blazing torches, lanterns, and weapons, they arrived at the olive grove. Jesus fully realized all that was going to happen to him, so he stepped forward to meet them. What are you looking for? He asked. First point. If you look at Jesus having to, let's say, accept the sovereignty of God because he knew what was going to happen, the first thing we see here is he doesn't run from it. He steps forward and meets him. But there's a detail you need to see here that as I was studying this in the last couple of weeks, I'd never realized. It has to do with that a contingent of Roman soldiers. We look at Judas betraying Jesus, and we've talked about that, and Jesus knew that was going to happen, okay? But what you need to understand here, when you look at the Greek text here, the proper word is really a Roman cohort. What's a Roman cohort? When you look at how the Romans grouped soldiers, we're talking about 500 to 600 soldiers. Picture this. There's Jesus and 11 people behind him, right? because Judas is gone. Jesus come to the other side now, and he's with these soldiers. They're looking out at 500 to 600 armed soldiers. I had always pictured this in my head as a really small group of men. Nothing could be further from the truth. But here's what we need to understand. We need to start thinking about Pilate, the sovereignty of God, and the part that he played. And as y'all talked about this morning, the decisions that people make, the decisions that God ordains or allows, and how we mix and stew all that together. Here's what this Roman contingent means to us. That the Jews, we know, have been wanting to kill Jesus for a while. You go back to the raising of Lazarus, and the Jews realized, when you go back and look at that again, that they wanted to kill him because they were afraid that Jesus was going to take their place, being connected to the power brokers in Israel. Okay? We look at the trials of Jesus, and we're going to look at it, and we're going to see how Jesus was brought before Pilate. The fact here is this. Those Jews, that contingent of Roman soldiers, Judas did not have the power to go round those men up and say, follow me. The Pharisees did not have the authority to go summon a bunch of Roman soldiers and say, hey, come with us and we're going to go get Jesus. Right? How did those soldiers get there? On whose authority? Pilate. Pilate's running the place. He's the manager. Right? Here's what this shows. Pilate is very aware of what Jesus is about. This is not a new thing to him. This has been brewing for a while. So what must have happened is this. Judas probably knew where Jesus was going to be located. Right?
Right. Yeah.
Judas furnished that part. So Judas goes to the Pharisees and he says, this is where he's going to be and this is when he's going to be there. The Pharisees, though, now their deal is this. They want all this to happen in secret. And that's why Jesus is drugged before Caiaphas at night. In other words, the Pharisees, when you look back in John, they say specifically, we got to do it this way, otherwise there'll be a riot of the people. Why? If you look at the history, just a couple days prior, what happened to Jesus? He rides into Jerusalem on a ticker tape parade. Remember, all the people were saying Hosanna? And the mob loves him, right? So Jesus has come in that way. There's this popular acclaim, which means Pilate and the Romans are fully aware of all of this. Okay? Judas goes and says, Jesus is going to be eating the Passover meal. Let's look at that for just a minute. The Romans were very aware of all the feasts that the Jews had. When you read the history of Pilate, normally he resides not in Jerusalem, but up in Caesarea, about 90 miles to the northwest. Pilate is in Jerusalem for this reason only. The Romans have to keep the Jews under control. Okay? This is a feast that's been happening for hundreds of years, if not thousands, right? When the Jews in Jerusalem and the pilgrims come in from all over the country to celebrate this. It's a big deal. Pilate's aware of this. You remember one of the disciples is Simon the Zealot, right? What were the Zealots? They were advocating for a political and military overthrow of Roman rule. So there's that faction. There's the Pharisees. There's the Sadducees. The Romans are aware of all these factions. The Romans are very aware that the Jews have been wanting to overthrow them for centuries. So think about it from Pilate's point of view. He's thinking this: I can't have a riot down there in Jerusalem with this big parade. So I'm going to go down there myself to make sure order is maintained. In the sovereignty of God, you have this man of his own free will deciding to make a journey about 90 miles, which is no small feat back in the days when you did it on a horse or on foot. And he's in Jerusalem at the right time. Why is he there? He's there simply to protect his political career. He's not there for religious reasons. Flip back to Luke 13. Let's look a little bit of Pilate's history. Luke 13, verse 1. Let's see what we know about Pilate. About this time, Jesus was informed that Pilate had murdered some people from Galilee as they were offering sacrifices at the temple. What does that tell you about Pilate and the Jews? What does that tell you about Pilate and his viewpoint of the Jewish religion? He has no trouble slaughtering them. Okay? He has no trouble slaughtering them.
And he did it in violation of, he went into the temple to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, which is another sacrilege
Yes.
Right.
right there.
So it's a violation
Yeah, it's a violation of the
because
protocol.
he has no care.
Right. So what we see here about Pilate is this: I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep these Jews under control. Because when you read about the Jewish and the Romans' relationships with each other back in this time, it was always contentious. The thing that you need to understand from a Roman ruler's point of view is this: you have the Roman emperor in Rome, Italy. And then you have, of course, Judea and Galilee. And if you were a Roman prefect over Judea or Galilee, and you couldn't keep those Jews under control, you got summoned to Rome and you got fired. Pilate has seen all this. So Pilate, as a politician, is going to bend or break whatever rules he's got to bend or break to keep himself in office. So, all that you need to understand, that's why this 500 to 600 armed Roman soldiers showed up on the Mount of Olives at about 2 o'clock in the morning. So, this is the situation that Jesus is in. Go ahead.
Excuse me, how many, 500, how many did he have? 1,000, 10,000 soldiers under his?
Under his jurisdiction,
Yes.
total in
Yeah.
Judea, I have no idea.
Just,
That's
He's
right.
just saying how much.
well,
it
well,
is.
but by default then, 500's a big number, so again, also, if he can casually pull 500, then that would
He's
imply
got-
that he's got much, much more.
Yeah, and I'm sure he probably could.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what else does this number show you? How scared they were of Jesus.
Yes.
Verse 6.
Yes.
How scared they were of Jesus.
Absolutely.
You don't send 500 against one, do you? Todd?
Nothing. I thought the Roman soldiers, not to answer Terry's question, a legion is 6,000.
Right.
And I thought on the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah, where you see as the Rock of the Dome, which is not Jews, that's where they lived. And they would have come out through the Golden Gate. You're sitting in the Mount of Olives and the Golden Gate's like over here. They would have seen them, but that's only like 10% that they sent out. I'm not saying it's not a large number.
Right.
I'm curious, I didn't quite get the 500, where you got that from, that one word, but anyway, I'll get it. It's like, Jesus, the disciples would have seen them coming. I mean, it's like sitting in a football stadium looking down at the players.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that's like the view of the Mount of Olives, the Kidron Valley, and back up. And then you have the wall, and then the Temple Mount, and then the Golden Gates right there. And that's where Jesus rode the donkey through.
Right. Right.
And that's where they came through.
Right.
The part I'm not 100% of is they lived up in there, because I watched so much junk.
Well, and also the logistics to support 500
Yep. You get, takes a lot of torches, takes a lot of,
food.
it's not a small thing to send out 500 or 600 men in the middle of the night. Right? But what I want you to see though is this. All the parties knew each other. Like politics in Washington today. All the parties knew each other. Okay? And like politics in Washington today, there's a lot of slandering that's about to go on. There's a lot of slandering that's about to occur. And the reason that slander occurs is because there's a contest for power.
Yeah. Who's in charge?
Who's in charge? Who's going to run the show? But what we need to see is in the sovereignty of God, God's running the show.
Yep.
That's what we need to see. Is that although from a human point of perspective, you have all these power brokers, stuff going on, that from our perspective, and we're going to see from Jesus' perspective, which is the ultimate perspective, that God is running the show. And before it's over, we're going to see Jesus make one statement. And that one statement is going to answer the controversy that I started at the beginning about the interaction of human agency and what God ordains or allows. All that's going to be wrapped up this morning. But, yes?
There's a couple of things came up here that I never realized, like you. I always pictured 4 or 5 Roman soldiers.
Yes. I do
Never
too.
that many.
Yeah.
And then in verse 6, when they said to him, wanted to know who he was, he said, I am he.
Yes.
And they fell to the ground, all 500 of them. That's how much they must have been afraid of him.
That's a great point. And here, there's 2 ways of looking at it. One is a perspective you brought out. And that's kind of what John is trying to do here when he says the I am, he, right? The other thing is this. When you're a Roman soldier and you don't really know what your enemy is about to do, you're not going to stand up and be vulnerable. You're going to go like this.
Oh.
So there's that perspective too, that these soldiers don't really know exactly who they're dealing with. Not only that, they don't know what Jesus' followers are about to do. That could have been a code word to attack, right? All of this is possible. We don't know for sure. So you have to look at it not just from a theological perspective, which is what we tend to do. What we need to do is look at it from a human perspective, which is what they had. Those Romans, I know. So those Romans are sitting there. They have no idea what they're about to come up with. And all they know is that Jesus is the leader. So what do you know is that if you're a military guy, one thing you know is this: there's a commander somewhere. And that commander's calling the shots. So when Jesus makes his statement, they're not thinking, oh, that's a religious statement. Oh yes, I remember Exodus. No. If you're a soldier, what are you thinking? I'm here to fight. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, also, they had heard, I'm sure, like everybody, this man had power. He had done all these things, so it wasn't like this guy, he was just an itinerant walking around. They knew, and that was the fear, because this guy has some kind of power and they don't know what it is, and they don't get it.
He had power
Yes.
that threatened them 2 ways.
Yes.
One is they knew Lazarus was raised from the
Right.
dead. When you read that account, that's when the Pharisees really said, we got to kill him.
Right.
Which to me is utterly silly,
Right.
because it's like, you raise somebody from the dead,
Exactly.
do you really think you're going to win? The other thing though is they've seen the ticker tape parade. So if you're out there and you're that Roman soldier, you know there's 11, but you know this man just had thousands fall at his feet.
Yeah.
Who knows who's over the hill?
It's true.
Like Todd said, geography. You don't know who's hiding behind the trees. Anyway, all that's wrapped up in that encounter. Okay?
Jimmy,
Mhm.
I liked my storybook. That Jesus Christ used who he is, I am, and just his words knocked them flat. That's what I like.
Sure.
That's what I'm gonna stick with.
Okay. Well, here is the deal.
I'm with her.
What do we know about Roman soldiers? You remember the centurion?
Yes.
I think it was it that had the daughter, was it the daughter that was healed?
Yes.
Jarius' daughter.
Jordan, okay. Here's the deal, just because you're a Roman soldier doesn't mean you all believe the same thing.
Right.
Right.
If there's one thing we see in the,
Centurion had a servant.
yes, if we see one thing in the Gospels, we see constantly changing, shifting opinions of people. All the way through. So, you have these soldiers here. Anyway, you have all these perspectives going on. Jesus makes his statement. They do what they said, okay? Jesus knows they're looking for him, which to me makes his question silly. Who are you looking for? Why did he say that? He wanted them to own it. In other words, this. He didn't just say, and if you look at this, we'll see this all through this morning. Jesus, even though he knows all this, in the sovereignty of God, and here's the key statement, he makes everybody own their decision. Even though he knew he had to die, he makes everybody own their decision. What does that mean for us? In the sovereignty of God, you may be struggling with something. You may be having to go through something. But here's the thing. There's always people around you, right? Family members, spouses, children, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Everybody has to make their own decision about how they see what you're going through. Everybody has to make their own decision about what you're going through and how they're going to process it. Are they going to learn from it? Are they going to fight it? How are they going to look at it? So Jesus puts them on the spot. Who are you looking for? Jesus the Nazarene. I told you I'm he said. Since I'm the one you want, let these others go. Point number 2. In the sovereignty of God, when I'm struggling with something, some adversity, some loss, some whatever it is, ultimately it's up to me alone to go through it. I love her. But in the sovereignty of God, ultimately, she has to face her life. I have to face my life. You have to face your life. He has to face his life. So there we have that. Next scene, verse 19. Simon Peter drew a sword, slashed off the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's slave. I love this. Do you remember when Peter said, I'll die with you, Jesus, right? You remember? And Jesus turned right around and what did he say? Before as the sun comes up, you're going to deny me 3 times. We look at Peter as being a very weak, vacillating person at that point, don't we? He denied Christ. I would never do that. What does this show us about Peter? Peter sees 500 to 600 Roman soldiers, and he says, I'm going to go down and fight them. Is that not a death wish or what? When you as one man with one sword takes on 500 people? I submit to you that Peter had guts. He meant at this point, he meant what he said when he said, I will die with you. Let's give the man credit. He is a Green Beret soldier at this point. He takes the sword, he cuts the ear off. Jesus said, put your sword back into its sheath. Here is Jesus' key statement. Shall I not drink the cup of suffering that Pilate has given me? Shall I not drink the cup of suffering that my husband forced on me? Shall I not drink the cup of suffering that my boss inflicted on me? Shall I not drink the cup of suffering that thy neighbor inflicted on me? This is Jesus' statement of the sovereignty of God. This is Jesus' statement from a human point of view of saying, this is between me and God. God has brought me to this point, and I have to do it. That is a statement that all of us have to say when circumstances grind us to a powder. Life becomes heartbreakingly hard. You don't know which way is up. This is the statement that you're left with. Let's go back to old buddy Job. What did he say when he lost it all? God has given, God has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And then the next chapter, in chapter 2, when his wife has her own viewpoint, when she says, curse God and die. What did Job say at that point? Shall we only accept good from God and not accept adversity? Job, who had guerrilla marauders take and steal his livestock, burn his fields. Job, who saw a wind destroy his kid's house, it all falls on him, and every one of his kids die in one fell swoop. He did not blame it on the weather. He did not blame it on those bad guys who killed all of his servants, left their bodies rotting in the field.
He didn't even blame Satan.
He didn't even blame Satan. Job saw it the way Jesus saw it. I have come to the firm conviction that dealing with the sovereignty of God is what separates the men from the boys. Can I make a statement like Jesus made or like Job made? That is the biggest question of my life. So Jesus says, shall I not drink the cup of suffering? And repeatedly this motif of a cup, you see Jesus using it a lot all the way through John.
And this is the third cup, the cup of redemption, in case you wanted to know.
Yep. So, let's keep going. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. And where will we skip to? Ah, yes. Pick up with me in verse 22. Jesus is being questioned by the high priest. And just a little bit of a backstory. There's Caiaphas, who's the high priest that year. But Caiaphas has a father-in-law named Annas. And when you synchronize all four of the gospel accounts, you see both of these characters, okay? But it's one of these deals. Have you ever watched gangster movies with the mafia, like The Godfather? And there's this character called the Don, who's kind of the ultimate power broker, right? And he's the one calling the shots, even though he has his underlings that are kind of actually executing his decisions. Caiaphas is the son-in-law, and he knows which side of his bread is buttered on. Which means Annas, the father-in-law, is really the one probably calling the shots here. But once again, when you kind of dissect all the four accounts, and you see the interaction of that, it's like they're both acting kind of as a team, but sometimes separately. Anyway, Jesus is in front of either one or both of these men. It's not really clear at this point. Probably Caiaphas for sure. So in verse 22, let's pick up verse 20. Jesus replied, everyone knows what I teach. I have preached regularly in the synagogues and the temple where the people gather. I have not spoken in secret. Why are you asking me this question? Ask those who heard me, they know what I said. Then one of the temple guards standing nearby slapped Jesus across the face. Is that the way to answer the high priest? He demanded. Jesus replied, if I said anything wrong, you must prove it. But if I'm speaking the truth, why are you beating me? Here's what I want you to see from Jesus' reply. Jesus knows what he has to face, does he not? He knows what he has to face. if that's true, why did he just go to these, when he's been interviewed upon these people, why didn't he just say this? Why didn't he say, you know what, I have to be crucified, let's get on with this, where's the cross, let's get it over with. No. Why is Jesus bothering to argue with these people?
It's like you said earlier, he
Yes.
wants them to own
Exactly.
it.
He wants
Exactly.
them to own their decision.
Thank you.
So he
Let
asked
it
them,
haunt them the rest of their life.
and not only that,
Afterlife.
think about it this way. The irony is this. The purpose of the cross is to justify us before God. The reason I say the irony of it is because God uses injustice, an innocent man dying from a human point of view. He uses injustice to accomplish justice. What human would ever do that? That's what makes me believe in the Bible. Nobody would come up with that kind of scheme. Where I'm going to use a lynch mob, basically, I'm going to use injustice to accomplish the ultimate justice. However, along the way, being a clever God that I am, I'm going to make all these humans own their injustice. I'm so smart that I will use their injustice to accomplish the ultimate justice. So Jesus, instead of saying, look, guys, in just a few short hours, I'm going to say, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. So I'll just go ahead and give you a heads up. I'll forgive you right now for slapping me. Does that not make sense? Because like I said, in just a few short hours, he's going to pronounce forgiveness for them all. But right here, what does he do? He holds them accountable. You did something wrong, and I'm not going to let it slide. Here's what that means for you and me. Even though in the sovereignty of God, I may be suffering some injustices from people, it does not mean that I'm wrong by pointing my finger in their face and saying, you did something wrong to me. We think that if I have to go through this, I have to go through it this way. What Jesus says is this: you will go through this, but you can still hold all the players in your life accountable every step of the way. Rodney, were you going to say something?
In Proverbs 9, I think it's 9, it talks about wisdom, and one of the pillars of wisdom is rebuke. Not only to be rebuked and learn from instruction and understanding, but to rebuke.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think of this when
Yes.
Right,
I said that.
right. Yeah, go
I was
ahead.
just gonna say, and that's why people, and then, they don't like it, they hate that. See,
Mhm.
people hate that, you're telling me that, I don't wanna hear it, I don't wanna see it.
I don't wanna hear it.
I don't wanna own it.
Yeah,
So they hate it, he said that, they'll
Yeah.
hate you just like they hate me.
yeah,
It's just like Job's friends, he rebuked them back,
right.
and they got more angry.
Yes, right,
How dare you?
right, right.
That's true.
So, we see Jesus basically not letting them slide. Here's the thing, he says, but if I'm speaking the truth, why are you beating me? Well, let's look at what the response is. Then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to
Yeah.
Caiaphas, the high priest. What is that showing us here? He did not have a good answer, and otherwise he would have given it. But you know what people do when they're rebuked like this and they don't have a good answer? They take what their problem is and give it to somebody else to fix it. In other words, if this man, if Annas would have been really confident of the ground he was standing on, why didn't he keep Jesus in front of him, pronounce the sentence, and get on with it? Instead, he boots him down the road to his son-in-law and says, here, little boy, you deal with it. They all want him dead, but they don't have the guts to do it.
Take responsibility.
Here's what we need to understand in the sovereignty of God. Jesus at this point appeared to be the weakest man in the room. Right? But I submit to you, Jesus is really the strongest man in the room. As evidence, first of all, when the 500 to 600 came, he stepped forward. Said, what do you want? Okay? And as evidence right here, when he gets slapped, he doesn't cower in fear. He turns right around and says, why did you do this? Okay? These men, and we're going to see Pilate in a few minutes, that have the cloak of political power, they don't have the guts. So you tell me, here's the deal. When you are in a situation wrestling with the sovereignty of God in your life, you may look like the weakest person around. But sometimes if you peel back the layers of what's really going on, you'll see you may really be the strongest one.
Can you answer a question for me that I've had for years and years and years?
Oh, boy.
We see that Jesus is slapped, and he, like you said, he turns around and he rebukes. But then in his previous gospel, he says, if somebody strikes you on the right cheek, turn your left to them as well. I'm thinking, wait a minute.
Here is the deal. It's one thing to be slapped by your next door neighbor. It's another thing to be under the thumb of a corrupt political judicial system. The tension is this, okay? And it's like Paul in 1 Corinthians 7. In the context of that, he's talking about marriage and remarriage. But he says, if you're a slave and you can gain your freedom, do it. But if you can't, accept it. And I'm paraphrasing that, but that's what he says. The tension here in this is...
So you're saying if you're married, you're in slavery?
You said that, I didn't. The tension is this, Rodney, is that we try to reduce our decisions to black and white binary decisions. And what you see, and you brought up a great point here, is that it's all about the context. It's all about the context. That's why I made this little statement this morning from Theodore Roosevelt about 9/10 of being wise is being wise in time. The right answer over here for Jimmy may not be the same as the right answer over here for Jimmy. But we do it with good hearts. We do it with good hearts. We want to do the right thing, but sometimes we get heartburn because the right answer here is not always the right answer here. Here's the deal, though, to drill a little deeper. Jesus knew all of this about what he had to do, right? So I ask you this. When he rebukes Annas, is he being disobedient? Is he? No. It's okay to go to the rulers of the state and cry foul. It's another thing to go to your neighbor and cry foul. Also, if you want to, I'll bring up another little twist to what you said. And Jesus also in the Sermon on the Mount said this: if the soldier, which obviously is a Roman, and what he's referring to, makes you carry his load 1 mile, what does he say? Carry it 2. So that same Jesus who said that goes right around to the commander, Pilate, to Annas, and says this. And we're going to see him argue with Pilate in a minute. So I submit to you this, Rodney. Whatever the right answer is, I'm on safe ground doing 2 things. One is doing what Jesus did with Annas, and what we're going to see him do with Pilate. But the other side of the coin is when Jesus is on the cross and says, forgive them all. So there's your conundrum. Jesus wraps all of these mysteries in the space of a few hours that we wrestle with throughout our lives. Okay? But when Jesus did all of this, he did it underneath what I call the umbrella of the sovereignty of God. That's just like you and me. That's just like you and me. So, Annas boots him down the road to Caiaphas. Peter goes through his denials. I want to pick up the story now when Jesus is in front of Pilate. Okay? So, we don't see it in John's account, but basically Caiaphas does what Annas does. He asks Jesus some questions, but once again, instead of really nailing it down and proceeding with everything, Caiaphas sends him down to Pilate. Why? Because if they want Jesus dead, they don't have the authority to do it, so they know eventually they have to go through the Romans. So, Jesus is in front of Pilate. Let's pick up in verse 28. Jesus' trial before Caiaphas ended in the early hours of the morning, and he was taken to the headquarters of the Roman governor. His accusers didn't go inside because it would defile them, and they wouldn't be allowed to celebrate the Passover. So Pilate, the governor, went out to them and asked, "What is your charge against this man?" Let's stop right there. I'm not going to turn to it, but I know from reading other passages, it says this: Pilate knew Jesus was drugged in front of him out of envy. In other words, Pilate knew the Pharisees were envious of Jesus' popularity. However, being a politician, he's got to play this little game. Okay? And the game goes like this: I've got to make sure people think I'm going by the rules, but I know what's really going on over here. So, he asked, Pilate the governor asked, "What is your charge?" Here's the deal. Instead of just naming the charge, what did they do? We would hand it over to him if he weren't a criminal, they reported. Think about it this way. Let's take a modern courtroom. And let's say I drag you into the courtroom and I'm the district attorney. It's my job to prosecute people. And so the judge says, "Well, what's the charge?" And I say, "Judge, that's a silly question. If they weren't dirty, I wouldn't have them here." A trial is supposed to be a what? Not about innuendo, but about facts. It's not what you think, it's what you can prove, right? That's what trials are about. Facts. You separate fact and fiction. So, Pilate says this: "I'll kill him for you." No, what does he say? "Take him away, judge him by your own law." I call it the hot potato. When you give a politician a hot potato, what does he do with that hot potato? He passes it on. Annas, Caiaphas, and Pilate, regardless of their external situation, were all politicians at heart. And a politician's chief ambition is, I want to get what I want, but make the people think I'm serving them while doing it.
Boy, does this all sound familiar?
Doesn't
You're
it
not
all sound
kidding.
familiar?
You are not kidding.
But what we need to see is all this happens once again under the cloak, under the umbrella of the sovereignty of God. So God lets all these politicians be politicians. Okay? So, only the Romans are permitted to execute someone, the Jewish leaders replied. This fulfilled Jesus' prediction about the way he would die. Then Pilate went back into his headquarters and called for Jesus to be brought to him. He doesn't say, "Jesus, what have you done?" at this point. What does he say? He says what every politician says when they're worried about losing their power. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Why did Pilate say that? Because Pilate knows the Romans are actually ruling the Jews. But he also knows about these groups called the Zealots and these other groups that are wanting to take their power back. So he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" I love Jesus' answer. What does Jesus do? He doesn't say, "I sure am." He doesn't say that. He doesn't say this. Let me explain something to you, Pilate. Even Peter doesn't get it. I'm supposed to be this Messiah. They think I'm going to come and conquer you. But if you ask your soldiers that you sent out to arrest me just a few hours ago, keep that in mind, that they'll tell you that when my followers tried to take out a sword and start an armed conflict, I stopped it. Here's my point. If I'm hauled in front of the judge, And especially if it's unjust, I'm gonna do the first thing that you're gonna do. I'm gonna start defending myself. Look, Pilate, you got it wrong. I'm not trying to do anything wrong here. I'm just this religious rabbi teacher. I'm harmless. When my followers tried to start an armed rebellion a few hours ago, I stopped it. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't defend himself. Instead, what does he do? He turns the focus from himself and his innocence to Pilate, what do you think about me? Is this your own question? In other words, Pilate, are you sincerely interested in who I am? That's really what he's saying, right? Is this your own question? Or Pilate, basically, are you a mouthpiece for others? In other words, Pilate, is this your own authentic, sincere question? Or did other people put this in your mouth and you're just a puppet? Think about that when you're hauled up in front of a judge, and basically the judge is asking you a question, and you respond back like this: Judge, do you really care about who I am, or are you just a puppet on the string up there on that bench?
Uh-oh.
Right? That to me is a very ballsy thing to do that Jesus did. Okay? But he does that, and that shows you the heart of Jesus. And here's what I mean by that. Even though Jesus knows all that's about to happen, he still looks as Roman governor, who, as we saw in Luke, has already killed Galileans, right? Who's already killed Galileans, profaned the temple, who's done all that. Jesus knows all that. He looks this man in the eye and basically says, what kind of a relationship do you want to have with me? Is this your question? If it is, I'll answer it this way. If it's not your question, I'm going to answer it this way. In other words, Pilate, do you want to have an honest conversation? Or do you just want to keep playing the political game? All of that is wrapped up in this. Think of the woman at the well. Remember the woman at the well? You remember how she tried to make the argument about where you should worship? And how did Jesus respond? Don't call your husband. It's the same type of thing here. And I love this. Jesus gets to the root of what's in these people's hearts. He is not hoodwinked by the superficiality of the conversation. So even though Jesus has to go to the cross, he looks this man in the eye and he says, look, I will have an honest conversation with you if you want to have an honest conversation with me. Jesus gives him a reply, and Pilate does not know what to do with this one. My kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. My kingdom is not of this world. I don't know if Pilate knew about the ear being cut off. Scripture's not clear. But if he did, when Jesus answered this, basically what Jesus is doing, he's connecting this statement about his kingdom to what just happened back there in the garden. My kingdom's not of this world. That's why I told my followers to put away the sword. And that's what he literally says. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But he said, no, it doesn't work that way. Pilate, at this point, has a problem. Either he could decide he wanted to have an honest conversation like a woman at the well, or he could just keep playing the political game. Pilate decides to play the political game. He doesn't say, who are you, Jesus? He doesn't say, Jesus, tell me more about this kingdom of another world. If a Galilean peasant came to my front door and said, I'm from Mars and I've got a whole army out there, you just don't see them, I'd be a little interested to know if he's sane or not. Would you not? If someone comes up to you and says, I have a kingdom, but it's not of this world, you're going to think they're got all the marbles? I'd be curious. Pilate goes past all of that. He says, so you're a king. Pilate keeps wanting to focus on Jesus' authority, not his purpose. Pilate keeps wanting to focus on his authority, not his purpose, which is what all true politicians are about. It's all about the power. So he keeps wanting to focus on this kingship. Jesus doesn't end run around the question, though. You say, I'm a king. Actually, I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. All who love the truth will recognize what I say is true. This answer to Pilate is similar to the one that Jesus, when he got slapped, if I did something wrong, tell me what it is. A courtroom should be all about facts, should it not? A courtroom should be all about establishing facts, or in this case, establishing innocence or guilt, should it not? Jesus says this, if you love the truth, you'll be interested in me, because that's why I'm standing in front of you today. In so many words, that's what Jesus says. I was born, came into the world to testify to the truth. But then, in Jesus' next statement about all those who love the truth will recognize what I say is true, he's challenging Pilate, and he's basically saying this, if you love the truth, you will be listening to what I say. If you could care less about the truth, you will ignore me. Right? That's so basically what he says. Pilate, and this is where I have trouble with the Bible. I really wish it would give me pictures of facial expressions when certain statements are made. Here's what I mean. Pilate says, what is truth? We just read that. Is it, Jesus, what's truth? In other words, that would make it sound like truth is totally up to you to decide. That would make it sound like truth is not a fixed point or a fixed fact. In the 70s, when I became a Christian, it was called situation ethics. Remember that one? Situation ethics means whatever is right or wrong depends on the situation you're in. What can be true for you cannot be true for me. It's just up to us to make the call. So Pilate, is he saying, what's truth? It's like, Jesus, that's stupid. We all know you can't figure that out. Or is he saying, like a true skeptic, what is truth? I don't know. I don't know. One person has contempt for it because they don't believe it exists. The other one is what I call a skeptic who doesn't think it's attainable. There's a difference. But there's another one that could say this, what is truth? In other words, what's implied there is that I know what truth is. This is either truth or not truth. We don't know how Pilate said that. That's the problem. That's why I wish we had the facial expressions. That would clear all this up. Then Pilate went out again. Why is that statement important? If I ask Jesus what is truth, here's what, if I'm really interested in the answer to that question, here's what I think happened. If I say, what is truth? Okay, people, what do you think about it? What does that show? I didn't stick around for the answer. He went out again. He left Jesus. He didn't stick around with Jesus to get the answer to his question.
It's almost like he said, what is truth?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whatever his real attitude was, my problem is this. He didn't stick around for the answer. He proceeded with the legal proceedings. So whatever his motivation was, what is clear from his actions is that he really did not care enough to get the answer. What does Jesus do? Wait, Pilate, come here, I'll tell you what truth is.
Jesus.
Jesus doesn't do that. In the sovereignty of God, Jesus will let him go. In other words, with Annas, with Caiaphas, and now with Pilate, what we see Jesus is doing is this. When you want to shut down the conversation, I'll let you shut it down. I'm not going to beg you to listen to my plea for innocence. I'm not going to beg you to listen to me explain truth. I'm not going to keep you from blowing the guy's head off. Jesus says, I will let you make your own decisions. I will let you make your own decisions. But you know the end of the story. Did God ever lose control? I will let you make your own decisions, but I will not lose control. So, Pilate goes out, and he says to the group, he says this, he's not guilty of any crime. I ask you a question. When the judge bangs down his gavel in the courtroom and declares the accused innocent, should it not be over? Should that not be the conclusion? Right? It should be, but we both know that's not the conclusion here, is it? So, then he says, but you have a custom of asking me to release one prisoner each year at Passover. Would you like for me to release this king of the Jews? He doesn't call him the Messiah. He doesn't call him a rabbi. Right? He refers to him as a position of authority. He's the king, but he refers to him as this, the king of the Jews. I'll release to you the king of the Jews, but by the way, he's not the king of me, because I'm a Roman. That's what's unsaid. So, then Pilate has Jesus whipped. Skip down to 19, verse 6. When they saw him, the leading priests and temple guards began shouting, crucify him, crucify him. What does Pilate say? Take him yourselves and crucify him. Once again, I find him not guilty. Okay? So for whatever Pilate was about not believing Jesus and not seeking truth, Pilate says makes one thing clear, he's innocent. Pilate would be a good Methodist, and here's why. When I had my debates, here's the deal. When I had my debates with Methodists years ago, and I said, who is Jesus? He's a good man,
Yes.
but he's not God. Pilate is saying he's a good man, he should be let free, but he's not God. Right? Pilate says he's a good man, he's innocent. In fact, Pilate stands up to the crowd, and Pilate announces to the world, he is a good man. He's innocent. Right?
Yeah.
However, Pilate draws the line there and says, you know who this good man is that I think he is? I think he's the king of the Jews. If you knew anything back then, if you were a citizen, you would know one thing. It would be a part of your life from the day you were born to the day you die. Either I'm a Roman or I am a Jew. When you look at the life of Paul, when he's hauled up in front of the courts, one of the first things he says is, I'm a Roman citizen. So anyway, the distinction is this. Pilate says he's an innocent man. He's a good man. Okay? But then he says, crucify him yourself if you want to. I'm not having anything to do with it. We're out of time. Come back. We'll pick up, same time, same station, same place. We'll continue the saga. Sorry to break it in the middle, but this lesson is probably one of the most important things I've ever learned, because it's what we all struggle with. The intersection of the sovereignty of God and your problems. Good.
And I